I could gush about this woman, our speaker, for a long time. This is the short bio that I put together. Short. This is the short bio. Born in Jefferson City, is a licensed physician and is certified by the American Board of Pathology in anatomic pathology, neuropathology, and forensic pathology. She received a Doctor of Medicine degree from St. Louis University School of Medicine. She completed residencies in both pathology and neuropathology and was a postdoctoral fellow in the National Institute of Neurological Disease and Stroke, all within the St. Louis University School of Medicine. She has served as the Chief Medical Examiner for St. Charles, Jefferson, Franklin, and St. Louis counties for many years. I mean, we're very lucky to have her in this particular position. Dr. Case has authored and co-authored a lengthy list of medical journal articles, reports, and book chapters in her fields of expertise. She has lectured extensively for professional organizations throughout the United States, as well as internationally, and for community groups. Her driving passion has been to serve the community by being at the forefront of notifying the proper law enforcement of public health authorities of deaths that have been caused by violence, hazard, and infectious disease. She has dedicated her career to the accurate determination of cause and manner of death for those particular agencies, law enforcement agencies, which includes the identification of murderers and the exoneration of the innocent. And let me say to you, many of you know I worked in the criminal justice system for years in the prosecuting attorney's office. One should never think that Dr. Case only testified for the state. She testified for the side that she thought was right, even if it was the defense. Okay, I think think about that. A lot can be said for that. She is one of the few forensic neuropathologists in the nation, and she is a leader in the field of forensic pathology and was instrumental in establishing teaching programs in in-depth investigation. And one last personal thing. As an advocate in the prosecutor's office, I had the death-related cases, meaning I would help the victims whose husbands, children, whoever were killed, and someone was arrested and prosecuted. Part of my job was to know what this woman was going to say and what kind of pictures she would have, because if it was horrible autopsy pictures, just imagine, you would never want to see your son, your husband, in that kind of state. So I would say usually when Dr. Case goes into the door, into the courtroom, why don't you leave? And people would say, no, I want to put my head down and I won't look. Well, heads would pop up, and once you see it, is it here forever? So she would have some really hard things that she would have to talk about. But we had a murder case that she had nothing to do with that was solved because of DNA. And our DNA expert, Dan Fonstock with the St. Charles County Lab, is a fabulous guy and is well-versed on DNA. And the defense attorney was well-versed on DNA. And Dan and this attorney were having what seemed to all of the rest of us in the courtroom a private conversation, because we didn't know what the hell they were talking about. Okay? DNA gets very complicated at times. You will never see that with Dr. Case. She explains things at a level that anyone sitting in the court would understand exactly what she's talking about. And that is a gift, and that is an art. And for that and all kinds of other reasons, we are so lucky to have Dr. Mary Case here in St. Charles County.
Well, I am delighted to be here to see all of you, lots of old friends and some new friends, and thank you, Joni, very much for that introduction. Am I on?
You are.
Okay. So, by the way, I am a new member of the Historical Society. What I'm going to talk about today is the history of the medical examiner system in this country, and then we'll talk about here in St. Charles, and a little bit about what it is the medical examiner does. And so, let's go next. If we have time, I will show a case. Talk about a case, an old case. I will not show any dead bodies. I promise you that. So because of our technology here, I'm going to have to kind of look there. So if I'm not looking at you, don't think that I'm not aware of you. So the coroner system is what our medical examiner system came from, and it came from Great Britain, from the UK, and they had a coroner system there 600 years before we did. I think we have missed a couple of, is this the first slide?
No, you just passed the slide. You got another slide.
Yeah, let's,
Yeah, that's it.
go to the next, okay. So the coroner system first can be documented in the English literature somewhere around 925, and it was formally described in 1194. The word coroner comes from the word crowner. So the crown had an interest in knowing why people died, but also in maybe getting their property. If you committed suicide, the crown would take those properties. So the coroner is the one that would regulate that. So our system came over with the early colonists back in the 1600s. There's evidence that autopsies were being done as early as 1647 in Massachusetts. The earliest teaching in jurisprudence was Benjamin Rush, and I'm sure this group is aware of him. He is a member of the Provincial Congress in 1776, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, so you're all familiar with him. And interestingly, in 1792, he wrote an article opposing capital punishment. So even then, there were ideas against capital punishment because it certainly existed. The earliest mention of a coroner, which is a lay individual, not a doctor, but the earliest mention of a coroner using a physician to help him figure out some of his death cases was around 1860 in Maryland. In 1868, the state of Maryland authorized the governor to appoint a physician as the coroner in Baltimore. So that physician now was a step up from having a lay coroner. In 1877 in Boston, the Commonwealth of the state, they adopted a statewide system that required the coroner to be replaced by a physician, and it was known as the medical examiner. So the first time that term came into usage was back then. In 1890 in Baltimore, the Board of Health mandated that two physicians, and they gave them the title of medical examiner, that they were to perform any autopsies that needed to be done by the coroner or by the state's attorney. Next. So the first real development of a medical examiner system that was kind of fleshed out and had rules and regulation began in 1915 in New York City. At that time, they eliminated the coroner office and established a medical examiner system, and they authorized certain investigations. The types of deaths were laid out, so that the jurisdiction would include deaths resulting from criminal violence, causalities that would be accidents, suicides, deaths that were not attended by a physician, people that were imprisoned, and any suspicious or unusual manner. And the medical examiner had the authority to autopsy these individuals and to do the testing that was necessary. The first chief medical examiner in New York City was Charles Norris. And then this is the third medical examiner, the father of modern medical examiner. He began in 1954, and he retired about 1973, and he died in 77. At that time, I was an early person in forensic pathology. I existed at that time as a medical examiner, and I remember Dr. Halpern. I saw him one time, and he died at one of our meetings in California. He was in San Diego at the American Academy of Forensic Sciences when he actually died. But he is considered one of our top leaders. Interestingly, he convinced the city of New York back in the 50s to build the building that is going to be a modern facility and house the medical examiner's office and what they call the Institute of Forensic Medicine. In New York City, right next to Bellevue Hospital, it's kind of on 26th and 1st, there is the medical examiner's office, and there are three buildings. The third building is a biological building that was built during the 9/11 situation, so that they would have, it was all DNA. There's an entire, it's like 16 stories now. So that building is entirely for biological specimens. The New York City Medical Examiner's Office was also the cradle of forensic toxicology. A man by the name of Alexander Gettler established the laboratory branch. Next. The first statewide medical examiner system was in Maryland beginning in 1939, and it used the New York system where they had a variety of policies that they would follow. All of their activities were documented in law, the kinds of cases they would be investigating. And basically it was a broad spectrum of cases, and it provided for autopsies and toxicology. There was also a unique method for appointing the medical examiner. Prior to this, medical examiners were usually appointed by a political figure, which is not what you really want, because then when that political figure gets mad at you, he just dumps you out. So forensic pathologists and medical examiners should be appointed for their credentials, for their qualifications. So this was done for the first time. In Maryland, they had two professors. They had professors of pathology from a couple of the medical schools. They had some people from the health department and from the state and the state police. So these people could look at somebody's credentials and decide whether that person was suitable to be the medical examiner. So let's talk about what forensic pathology is. So let's start with pathology. Pathology is a specialty in medicine. You don't go to a pathologist. They exist in hospitals where they do the laboratory testing of your blood and urine. There's a lot of other laboratory things that go on that you are not aware of. It's very, very sophisticated. That's clinical pathology. Surgical and anatomical pathology deals with parts of the body. For example, if you have a biopsy, you have an organ taken out, we just can't let the surgeons take out things without somebody looking at them, and that person is the pathologist. So pathology basically means the study of disease and injury. So in the hospital, it's a consultant to other physicians. Forensic pathology is the utilization of the knowledge of pathology to the resolution of legal issues. And you can apply any science to the forensic area. Engineering, all of the sciences can be applied in legal ways to resolve legal issues. The teaching of forensic pathology kind of began at Harvard in 1937. They established a chair of legal medicine. They had a man by the name of Alan Moritz as the first professor. And he also created a training program to teach forensic fellows. And I'm going to tell you in a little bit how you get to be a forensic pathologist, but we do that in a part of the training we call a fellowship. So he established a fellowship training. He also established seminars for teaching how to recognize homicides and various kinds of death for people that were involved in the police and criminal investigation. Harvard closed their department in 1967, but transferred all of the teaching of the forensic science part over to Maryland. They have a very big, fine state medical examiners system. So it was around this time that other cities and states began improving the laws that regulate how medical examiners and coroners come into being. So, next. So, how do you get to be a forensic pathologist? A number of people here ask me about that. So basically, you go to college, and then you go to medical school, and then you do a residency in pathology. So when doctors do their specialized training, it's after medical school and what we call a residency. So for pathology, that is 4 or 5 years. And that is followed then by what we call a fellowship, and that's a farther specialization. And so there's 1 year of that fellowship training for forensic pathology. In this country, there are 37 training programs we call where we can train these fellows, and St. Louis University has one of those training programs. The first board certification in forensic pathology was in 1959, and between 1959 and 2004, 989 people were certified. About 25 to 30 people a year complete fellowship, so there's not a lot of forensic pathologists. Only about 400 practice at any given time, and we need about 800 or 900. So there's a lot of jobs. I encourage anybody with young people who are like, go into this. So where does the medical examiner system fit in? It's a strange little orphan. The best place for it to fit is as a part of public health. And in St. Louis County, that is where, as the chief medical examiner, we exist within the health department. We have a separate building, but I am in the Department of Health. And that is the proper place for forensic pathology and medical examiner work, because we are very much public health. And I'm going to explain how that is. Sometimes the medical examiner system exists in an academic setting within a medical school. The city of St. Louis has a separate medical examiner system, you know, from St. Louis County. They are two different counties. So the city has a contract with St. Louis University to provide professional services. That means doctors that are forensic pathologists go down to the city and do the cases, and they provide the toxicology. The building, the maintenance, the other people that work in the system, those are all city employees. So the contract is only for professional services. Sometimes the medical examiner is a standalone system under the county executive. In Kansas City, Jackson County is such a system. It stands alone. It's not part of anything else. It's right under the county executive. St. Charles is the same way, and I'm going to talk specifically a little bit more about St. Charles in just a minute, and we'll talk about that. Where you don't want to be is with public safety, the law enforcement. We don't want to be a part of them because we have to investigate them. Whenever there is a jail death or interaction with the police officers, death in custody, that is a very serious thing, and there's going to be all kinds of accusations. So we don't want to be under jurisdiction of public safety or law enforcement. And very few are. There's a few places in California that have that relationship. And in Georgia, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation has a medical examiner system that is used for the small towns and areas that are outside of larger medical examiner systems. And they have been successful in being independent, but you really want to be independent from law enforcement. Medical examiners are part of Homeland Security, and we're recognized as first responders, although we're the last ones to get there. And the response that we're going to have is not one you want to get. So I'll tell you this, the only federal medical examiner system is the Armed Forces medical examiner system, which is an interesting thing that you probably never heard of, but it exists. In Dover, Delaware, there is a very large facility that has a morgue that is very, very modern, and this is where all the troops from any kind of war, they are flown directly to Dover, and autopsies are done by the Armed Forces medical examiner. These are men and women both, a number of women. They are in the military, and they do the examinations there, and it's very sophisticated. It's a wonderful opportunity for anybody to start out as a young forensic pathologist in the armed forces, because that training is very intense. So they study how people die in the wars, and they are looking at trying to provide better armament, body armor, how to prevent the blast injuries. There's a lot of blast injuries. So there's a lot of research that comes out of that. And every day when a military member leaves that facility, they're in a coffin and they are dressed in the uniform of their service branch. And everybody in the building comes out and stands at attention and salutes as those ambulances take the bodies away. It's a very moving situation to see. Those same medical examiners they have to deploy, as I always say, we can't even have a house plant because I never know if I'm going to come home tonight. You may be in Afghanistan tomorrow doing autopsies, not on anybody killed that is American troop, but there are things that they do over there. They also go around the country if there's a military plane crash or there's a death on any military installation, although lots of times they will let the local medical examiner do those cases. I've done any number of military plane crashes from Lambert. There's not like a whole lot of them, but over the years, I've been around for a long time, I've done a few. So let me mention the DMOR. So what we call the Disaster Mortuary Response Team. This is a pretty interesting thing, and you may be seeing some of this happening down in Florida with the condo collapse. So this was started by funeral directors that got together and they were trying to provide kind of help to anybody that was having a disaster. And it was taken over by FEMA after 9/11. So now it's a very regulated thing. And what it does, it provides forensic pathologists and mortuary support to any jurisdiction in the country and any of our, like Puerto Rico, where if you have a hurricane or a flood or a plane crash and your system is overwhelmed, there are forensic pathologists that don't work directly for DMORT, but they will be on a list. And so it's like, well, here, Puerto Rico's having a hurricane. I need 5 forensic pathologists to go for a week. And so they will send 5 down there. And if they don't get done, then more come in. And so a lot of the younger members of my profession, they'll sign up for DMORT, and when they can be available, they'll be deployed somewhere to do autopsies on those individuals. And always a big part of it is identification. So we see that, we had them in Joplin when we had the tornado down there. So how does the coroner medical examiner system, how do we get that system? What laws regulate that? Well, in every state there is a statute that establishes jurisdiction over certain classes of dead bodies that are of interest to public health and public safety. Our statute is 58 at 720. Coroners are in this state and they are lay individuals. Some people are very surprised as to what a coroner is. So a coroner is 21 years of age, you get elected from the county in which you reside, and there you go. No other qualifications. Once you get elected, there's a little bit of education, and all of a sudden you're in charge of determining how people die. So that's not a really good system, but it is, the coroners exist along with it. So medical examiners are forensic pathologists. Next. So in 21 states, there are pure medical examiner systems. 11 states have coroner systems. 4 of those, the coroner has to be a physician, but doesn't have to be a forensic pathologist. Kansas, Michigan, Ohio, I forget what the 4th one is. So there are 11 coroner states. And then there are 18 states that have mixed systems. Missouri and Illinois have a mixture. In the state of Missouri, if you have a population under 150,000, you're usually a coroner state, or a coroner county. Everything is on a county basis. So in the larger areas, you have a medical examiner. So St. Louis City, St. Louis County, Jackson County in Kansas City, those are medical examiner systems. Boone County and Callaway have joined together and they have a medical examiner system in Columbia. Greene County has a medical examiner system, but they've never been able to hire a medical examiner. So you know what they do? Somebody from elsewhere flies in every week. Somebody comes in for 3 days, does cases, and then goes home. Because there's just so few of us. I'm trying to get somebody down in Texas to fly in a few days a month for me. You know, we do what we have to do. Let's see, so Greene County has an ME, and so those are the medical examiner systems in the state of Missouri. In Illinois, they have a medical examiner system up in Chicago, of course, but everything else is a coroner. Their coroners are much better equipped. They have a better situation than our coroners. In the state of Missouri, our coroners make like $5,000 a year. So they have to have another job. And unfortunately, 60% of them are funeral directors. And that's very much a conflict of interest because they're going to be determining whether or not an autopsy should be done. And if you're trying to get the funeral, the family may not want it, and so you might say, well, I don't need to autopsy your body. So this is very much a conflict of interest. In the state of Missouri, we've had a blind coroner. We had a tow truck driver that said, well, I'm going to go to the scene to pick up the car, I might as well get the body. In Illinois, their coroners have a better educational background. They make a living wage, so they can do it. And particularly in counties like Madison and St. Clair, they run almost like a medical examiner system. And by the way, their budgets are more than St. Charles, and we are much bigger. We're twice as big, and I don't know how they get away with this, but I mean, everybody in the office has a car. Like, we have one car in St. Louis County, and I'm talking about for the death investigators. So it's like, wow, how do you get away with that? But anyway, the coroners over there, for example, they come to St. Louis University where we have a death investigators course, and it's in their law that they have to go and have that training that we give them. In Arkansas, those coroners have to come to St. Louis University and take this death investigation course. That's not true in Missouri. They provide their own training, which is not really very good. And I'm not speaking badly about them because it is the system we have, and we're not going to get rid of it because they are political entities and they have constituency and they're there to stay. Okay, so just to give you an idea of modern medical examiner systems, when did they come about? Chicago, Chicago became an ME in 75, so it's not like 100 years old. San Diego in 84, St. Louis County in 1969, the city in 77, and St. Charles in 1981. Next. So in 1981, St. Charles, if you look at the population, it's really interesting. Today, it's like, who knows how many people are in St. Charles County? We have no idea. Somewhere over 400,000. It's growing so fast you can't count it. But in 1980, it was like 149. So now they've become a medical examiner system. And the first medical examiner was a Dr. Jack Way. He was an emergency room physician at St. Joe's. And then the second one was Mike Knoyer, one of my neighbors, and he is an ENT doctor. Both of those people were doing this as a public service. They didn't want to do this work, but what was going on is before, when it was a coroner system, Doc Mueller, a chiropractor, was the coroner. So Doc Mueller continued in the medical examiner's office, and it continued just like a coroner office, except they had a doctor who would sign the death certificate. So in 1986, I met with Mike Knoyer, and I said, well, how would you like to get rid of that job and have a whole system here? And he said, I would support you in that attempt. And we were able to get that, and in that time there was a 3-judge commission, and so we were able to create a medical examiner system in St. Charles. And I became the first medical examiner that was a forensic pathologist. So at that time, I was a full-time tenured faculty member at St. Louis University. I had been on the faculty since I finished my residency in '73, and I stayed there until 2017. So that was part of my life. I was also working as an assistant medical examiner in St. Louis County. I began that in 1975. So I go way back. Nobody else in this country is as old as me doing what I do. And I love it. And I can run circles around most of those people. So at any rate, and I, knock on wood, I'm thankful for that. So the way that we set up our system to have a medical examiner system, nothing existed, so we had to create it. So at St. Louis University, we have a division of forensic pathology. And basically what that division does is education. We do death investigator courses. In 1978, we instituted this, what we call the basic death investigator course. And it's a week-long course, 8 hours a day. And people are talking about how you die and how to investigate it and what it looks like. I gave lectures on blunt trauma, child abuse, head injury, and alcohol. And other people we all gave multiple lectures. And so by the end of that week, you had a really good idea of how people could die and how you would investigate it. So we did that 3 times a year, and it is still ongoing. And then every other year, we would do a master's course, and it was 4 days long. And we would bring in an outside faculty, and they would talk about things that were going on around the country. For example, after the Oklahoma City bombing, the medical examiner came in and talked about how they worked all of that activity, what it looked like. And I don't mean, no, they don't show bodies necessarily, but they said, here are the problems that we have, and this is what you need to do, this is what you need to be aware of. For example, things that people don't know. They have these cadaver dogs that are looking for bodies. Well, this is what's going on in Florida. After about 3 days, there's no live people, and now they're all, you know, decomposing bodies, and the dogs would get so depressed that they took turns letting the dogs find a living person, one of them that were working. So things that you never know would go on that you have to deal with. This is how we learn. This is what we do at our professional meetings. So that's what the master's was. So when we developed the medical examiner system, what we did was, it was me. I did all the death calls for 9.5 years, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They called me, and I had a talking beeper, meaning in the middle of the night, my beeper would talk to me and give me a telephone number, which I could never remember. And I would get up, and I'd have to wait for it to happen again. For 9.5 years, and then we got some regular death investigators. Today we have 3 full-time death investigators in our office. When we began, we had a part-time secretary that did all the work, paperwork. Now we have about 5 people doing that work. So, but the office has grown tremendously, the number, and I'll get into that in a minute. So what SLU provided was everything that needs to happen in a death investigation system. Investigation, the doctors, the toxicology, the histology, and all of the administrative activities. And the bodies were examined at the St. Louis County facility. We made that arrangement. So St. Charles, all they had to do was put out money, and all of their medical examiner service got done. In 1992, Jefferson County came to me and said, well, will you do this for me? And then the next year, Franklin County did. So now we've got St. Charles, Jefferson, and Franklin counties. We've got contracts, and we're doing all of that medical examiner work. In 2017, after analyses by the St. Charles Fiscal Department, they decided that they were going to leave St. Louis University and establish the Regional Medical Examiner's Office, and they did that. And the office is now hosted by St. Charles. It's down on Boonslick in the Health Department building. All of the activity takes place there except for the examination of the bodies. That's over in St. Louis County in Berkeley, where we've always been. So the bodies go over there, but all of the activity takes place here. And it has worked very well. So I retired from St. Louis University as a professor of pathology, and it was hard to give up that academic activity, but I still do a lot of it. But what we have now is a very effective system. Next. So who are these people that we are interested in looking at? Violence by homicide, suicide, accident, that's pretty obvious. And to a medical examiner, by the way, homicide is not the same as murder. Murder is a legal term. But when I say homicide, that just means one person has killed another person. It could be a 3-year-old child that finds a gun and shoots his brother. That's not an accident, that's homicide. It's not culpable necessarily, but from the medical examiner, what goes on the death certificate is a homicide. Next. Drugs, medications, poisons, next. Related to trauma, regardless of interval, what that means is if you have an injury 20 years ago, car accident, or you get shot, and now you're paralyzed, and 20 years later you die, it's going to come to me to figure out, are they dying from that trauma? If it was a shooting, that would be a homicide. And people are still prosecuted many years down the road. So I do a lot of that. So all of these things I'm showing you, those bodies are not necessarily coming in to be autopsied. We only do 600-700 autopsies a year in St. Louis County and about another 600 in the regional office. But I do several thousand death certificates where I never see the body, but I'm going to do it by medical records and just investigation. So a lot of those trauma cases are in that category. Other types of blows and mechanical trauma, cutting and stabbing, firearms, explosions. These are all obvious things. There's a lot of asphyxial deaths, for example, strangulation, traumatic and positional asphyxia. Traumatic asphyxia is if a boa constrictor gets around you and squeezes, and you can't move your chest, that's traumatic asphyxiation, and we have that. Or if you're under a car that's jacked up and the car comes down and squeezes on your chest and you can't breathe, that's traumatic asphyxiation. So we have a lot of that, surprisingly. Not boa constrictor snakes, we have it. But, you know, positional asphyxia, what is that? If you get in a position where your diaphragm can't work, you can't breathe. Crucifixion, hanging on a cross. The way you die from crucifixion is traumatic, it is positional asphyxia. It fatigues your diaphragm and you stop breathing. If you are hanging upside down in a car and you can't get loose, that's positional asphyxia. Unfortunately, if you're not wearing a seatbelt and your car turns over, you may die in this way. This is and you're awake and alert. Drowning, hanging, gases, smothering, these are all examples of asphyxiation. Next. Vehicular accidents, next. Go ahead. Thermal, chemical, electrical, radiation, next. Weather-related, lots of things, you know, floods, lightning, hypothermia, hyperthermia, tornadoes, next. So those are all things that are pretty self-explanatory, but there are some things that now we're getting into the public health aspect, and I want to spend a little bit of time on that and explain how that works. People that die suddenly when in apparent good health. What does that mean? The medical examiner has the authority to do an autopsy on anybody that we need to do. If there is a college student that dies, somebody needs to have the authority to autopsy that individual. If they have meningococcal meningitis, the contacts of that individual need to be treated, and they need to be treated really fast. So I have the authority to autopsy that young person and determine why they have died, because they may be a danger to other people. Rapidly fatal illnesses. I was in Santa Fe when the hantavirus occurred. Remember that? We were over the weekend, we were doing a seminar, giving lectures, and the two medical examiners, the chief medical examiners from Albuquerque were there with me, and all of a sudden, it's like on Friday, they get called away. Well, there's several of these deaths that had occurred in the Four Corners. And so the rest of us are back there in Santa Fe, and we're watching what our colleagues are doing in Albuquerque, and we saw this evolve. And from Friday until Monday, they autopsied 5 people and determined, well, this is the hantavirus, and this is what we need to do about it, and this is how to keep from getting this. And so that's public health. We are part of that kind of effort, just like we spend a lot of time with people that die from drugs. Those are emerging trends that we make people aware of. People that die in public places. Think about Lambert Airport. 1 million people a year go through the airport. You know how many people die there? I probably see 20, 30. They're natural deaths, although occasionally we have some other things that occur there. But I will be signing the death certificates on those individuals and autopsying them if I need to. If you die or have an event in a plane when it lands, that's where the jurisdiction is. So we get some of those individuals, and there could be something in a public place that might be a danger to somebody. So the medical examiner is going to be that person that recognizes that problem. Remember when they had the cyanide thing in Chicago? So my colleague, who was the chief medical examiner there, discovered, well, you know, here's cyanide, that's what these individuals are dying from. And then it becomes a police investigation. They go back to that part of it, and within a very few days they determine what the problem was. So this is how we find out. This is how the CDC knows how people are dying in this country, because they get that information from the medical examiner. This is how the NIH decides what are we going to put our funding into for this death or that group of death, from that information that comes from the medical examiner's office. So this is our public health thrust. We are very much public health people. Maternal deaths, these are young women. We want to know why anybody would die in pregnancy or shortly thereafter. So that's part of our population. If somebody dies outside a medical facility without a doctor, that's going to come to the medical examiner. I sign thousands of death certificates every year. I have signed over 100,000 death certificates in my in my time. That's a lot, probably more than anybody living yet. When people die under anesthesia or during or following diagnostic or therapeutic procedures. Therapeutic procedure, that's an operation. Diagnostic, having a colonoscopy. If you die during that or a week later, I want to make sure that you're not dying as a result of that. So I'm going to autopsy you. There are elderly people that are having very high risk surgeries, and when they die, those deaths are all reported to me, but I get the chance to determine whether or not I need to investigate them farther with an autopsy. If you're having your thyroid removed and you die the next day, well, you might be bleeding and cutting off your airway. So I need to autopsy that individual. So these are, I'm not doing this to prove like misadventure or malpractice, but what I determine in my investigation will undoubtedly be used in some civil litigation, and that's fair game, but I'm doing it for other reasons because there could be some danger that is going on there that we need to alert the public to. Next. Deaths that are related to past or present employment. Think about things like asbestosis or black lung. It is the medical examiner's responsibility to look at, is there something in the workplace that's dangerous? And we most often have like electrical defects. They need to be corrected. We have things that people are falling out of various things that they die from, and then OSHA comes in. So the medical examiner is reporting deaths that occur to a large variety of federal agencies like OSHA and like the National Transportation System. And this is why we do this, so that we can keep people safe. Next. Then we have special categories that are of great interest. Children under the age of 18. So in this state, in 1990, there was a group of us that met in Jeff City every few months, and we created a law that is called a child fatality review process. Every state now has a law like that. And what it does is it prescribes that because children can die in such subtle ways, that we want to be able to investigate their deaths very thoroughly. And basically what we see is, if a child dies and you don't know exactly why that child is dying, then it's going to come to the medical examiner and we're going to do an autopsy. In the old days, in a coroner county, a coroner might just say, well, I think that's sudden infant death, and there would be no autopsy. Well, that is removed from their purview now. It will automatically have to be autopsied by a forensic pathologist. So it described a category of people that have to be investigated, and it made it so that only a forensic pathologist could do autopsies on those individuals. So let me explain the public health aspect of that kind of operation. How many of you have heard of SIDS? Everybody's heard of SIDS, okay. What SIDS used to mean is you had a baby under the age of 1, put it down to sleep, and sometime later you find it dead. And it meant, we don't know, we do an autopsy, but you don't find anything, and you don't know why that child has died. By medical examiner investigation, death scene investigation of those children, what we know, and I will say this, and I'm very proud of it, a lot of the papers came out of St. Louis County because we had very fine death scene investigation. So the deal is this: when you have a young child under the age of about 5 or 6 months, some of those children, not every single one of them, but many of them will have an immature response to the presence of carbon dioxide. So what does that mean? Well, you have a breathing center in the lower part of your brainstem, the medulla, that you don't have to think about breathing. When you breathe in oxygen and you breathe out carbon dioxide. When the level of carbon dioxide builds up, your brain tells you, take a big breath. If you went to sleep face down on a pillow, you wouldn't die if you didn't get enough oxygen. Your brain would tell you, you wouldn't even wake up, your brain would tell you, hey, move over into a fresher area so that you're not breathing in and out stale air. In these young children, many of them don't have that arousal response. So if you lay them face down on a pillow, they will die. And so what we know is that if you can prevent those deaths. when I have a death like that, and I have about 60 of them a year, there's 3,000 in this country every year, we can prevent every one of those deaths. And on the death certificate it reads suffocation, and the manner of death is accident. These are preventable deaths. That means I can educate people not to do that. So how many of you have seen the campaigns for unsafe sleeping? Every hospital now, wherever babies are delivered, before you go home, you get information about seat belts, you get information about safety seats, about feeding, about don't shake the baby, and about safe sleeping. So we can prevent this. Now, people still do it, but the hope is we can eliminate that. So there are many types of deaths that have been eliminated by that kind of educational activity, like bucket drownings. But I won't go into all of that, but this is what the medical examiner does. Our whole purpose in these children is prevention. It's not just to discover child abuse, it's to prevent children from dying. Anybody that is in custody of the law, you saw George Floyd die on the video. Anytime anybody dies in jail, in prison, any interaction, if law enforcement looks at you and you drop over dead, you're going to be very thoroughly investigated by the medical examiner so that neither side will be able to say that somebody erred. We want to find out why individuals are dying. So we look at those individuals very closely. People that die at home. You can't just have a dead body in the house and the funeral home come and get it and take it away. That does not happen in a medical examiner system. The funeral homes know that they have to call 911, the family does, so that law enforcement can come there and be the eyes and the ears of the medical examiner to tell me what's going on there. If the body appears to be a natural death, I can release it, but they can only be picked up by the funeral home if the medical examiner has released that body. If there's anything suspicious, it's going to come to me. So there's a lot of home deaths. What about under the care of other people? Nursing homes and hospice cases, those deaths are all reported to the medical examiner. We don't bring them in, these are all telephone investigations, but at least I have the opportunity to know something about them. There's 5,000 of those in St. Louis County. We have lots of nursing homes, so this is a huge burden. Next. Newborns that are delivered outside of the a medical facility. It's like, does that ever happen? Well, it happens all the time. And sometimes it's even twins, and sometimes people kill those kids. I've got 2 right now. One mother killed 2, and another mother killed 1. Both of those have been called homicide because they didn't immediately get help, and they neglected to support that child. And if you have a baby that's just laying on the floor, wet with blood, it's going to die. You have to warm them up, clear out their airway. So if you don't do that, you can't just say, well, I don't know what to do. The medical examiner is going to consider that a homicide. Anyway, anatomical materials. What does that mean? Well, every time a dog brings in a bone, a lot of times they call the police and they say, well, here's a bone, my dog brought it in, is it human? Where do you think that bone ends up? Comes to me, because I have a forensic anthropologist that can look at anything and say, well, that's a pig bone or that's a deer bone. But if it is a human bone, then the question is, well, is it a recently dead human? When the flood came in '93, we got a jawbone out of the riverbank here in St. Charles. It was 3,000 years old. So that goes to the state archaeological department, and they're very protective. Anything that has to do with Native Americans, boy, you better not touch that, because it has to be dealt with in certain ways. But if it's a recently dead body, then we are going to go all out to retrieve maybe other bones that would be present. So there is a lot of bone business. One of my investigators in St. Louis County is a PhD level forensic anthropologist. In this country, there are, I don't know, maybe 50 or 60 forensic anthropologists. And a lot of them are beautiful young women. You've seen Bones on television, These are really cool people. And they're so wonderful to work with because they can deal with the bones in a way that no one else can. So I'll mention something else about anatomical materials. One time there was a police officer up in the North County where he went out one morning and he looks in his backyard and there were eyeballs everywhere. So he brought these to me, and I said, well, those are cow eyes, you know, don't worry about them. And I thought that was the end of that. But I got a telephone, and this got in the news media, you know, because, right, Bill, people like to write about this. There were cow eyes in the yard. And, you know, somebody was playing a trick on his teenage daughter and got these, you know, undoubtedly from some kind of a rendering plant. But, so it was in the paper, and I got a call from this guy in Las Vegas, and he says, well, I need those eyes. I said, why would you want those eyes? He said, I'm in communication with aliens, and they want them. And I said, well, I got rid of them right away. Anyway, so at this point, I'm going to stop. I'm not going to do the case because we don't have enough time.
Oh, little bit of the case. Yeah.
We're good. Well, I mean, I can stop now, or I can go on. If you want me to do the case, huh? You want me to go? All right. If you want to jump up and run out, you can. All right. Well, let's go then. Okay. Let's get past that. So I'm gonna present a case that is from here in St. Charles. It's one of my favorite things to talk about. And it's been, you know, the subject of several movies and those autopsy things that come on late at night. Remember, in May of 1986, I was the newly appointed medical examiner. Next. And the previous system, you know, was coroner system, transitioned to an ME, but they didn't do forensic examinations. Out of all of their deaths, maybe 10 times a year, they would have an autopsy, but it was just done at the local hospital. So there was really no forensic expertise going on during the time that we're going to talk about. When I came along at the beginning, there was a lot of political turmoil. There were people that did not want St. Charles money going over to St. Louis. Why do we need to give them money to do our work? Let's get a forensic pathologist over here. Well, there's no way you're going to do that because there's so few of us. Then you can't, financially, you can't support one with that amount of work. So, next. And I mention that because, next. Next. This case, when it happened, it kind of quieted down that turmoil because it told people, well, here's why you need a person with forensic expertise. In October of 1986, there was a traffic accident with a single fatality, that head-on collision into this overpass. Do you recognize that? Mm-hmm. That's Mid-Rivers Mall. That's Highway 70 going west. That overpass, that's Mid-Rivers Drive. Look, that's 1983. Think about how different it looks. And there on the bottom left, that's where the mall is. So the car was going west, and it went into that bridge abutment where you see where it says the accident scene. So the guy is dead, but they take him to the hospital, he's pronounced dead, and then he comes to me as a traffic accident. Next. So he's got a gunshot wound to the head, so that's not a traffic accident. So what happened? Well, even though I took the credit for it, actually the guy that worked in the morgue that's going to do the x-rays, as soon as he saw this and I walked in, he said, Doc, that's not a traffic. That guy was shot in the head with a shotgun. I said, oh, that's interesting. I called the police so they can come because now we got a homicide. So what happened here, there was a man by the name of Michael Jackson. Now, he's not that Michael Jackson. It was a guy that was in Indianapolis, and he killed a couple of people, and he gets on Highway 70, and he's coming west. When he got into the St. Louis area, he was at the Galleria, and he did some shoplifting crimes or purse snatching, and the police now are kind of on his track because they know what his car is. And he is going west on Highway 70, and I'm going to show you the car. The car that this man is in looks like an unmarked police car. And they think what happened is Michael Jackson, his car was too close to the guy that gets killed, and he shot him, thinking he was a police officer. And then, of course, when he shot in the head, he goes off and runs into the bridge abutment. So Michael Jackson then goes on out west into Warren County and went to ground, as they say. And I knew people that lived in Warren County, and they left. They were so frightened because this homicidal maniac was out there somewhere. And after a week, they found Michael Jackson. He was in a barn, and he'd shot himself. And he'd been dead for several days at that point. Warren County, the coroner there sends that body into my morgue. This was the last autopsy that Dr. Gantner did. He was the first medical examiner before me, and he died after he had a heart transplant in 1988, and I became the medical examiner. This was the last autopsy that he did. And Michael Jackson, for some reason that I don't know, he was covered with blue paint. So at the autopsy, blue paint got onto our head block. And for years, we had the blue paint. We no longer have the head block. But at any rate, that is what happened to this man. Now, let's go back one. Go back another one. So this is the car, looks like an unmarked police car. The head-on collision caused the indentation there. Next. And you can see the windows blown out. There'd be no reason for that to be gone like that from a head-on collision. Next. And so there's blood on the window. This is, and that's the only blood I'm going to show you, by the way. This is not the scene of a car accident, obviously, and certainly by the time he comes into my morgue, I can tell it's not. Next. So why do we do what we do? Well, I can tell if somebody dies in a car accident or whether it's some other reason. Sometimes, remember who was the blues player, the old, right, you know, he didn't die from a car accident. He died from a medical event. He had heart disease that made him have a collision. And so this is something that we do all the time. Next. So I will say this, the police were thrilled by my ability to detect a homicide, even though it wasn't really me, it was the guy in the morgue. Next. So what happens next is the sheriff's office contacted me and asked me if I would look at an old case. And I said, of course I will. Because it's not uncommon for people to call and they'll say, can you look at this old case? Or they'll say, well, you look at this is a living person, but I need some help. The injuries that living people have are no different than if you're dead. So I do a lot of child abuse cases on living kids. I do people that have been assaulted, living people, and sometimes they actually bring them into my office. And sometimes those are prisoners, and I've got to look at their wounds. So, you know, this is not an unusual activity that the police would ask me to do this. So I say, sure, bring it to me. So this is the story of the case that they brought me, and that's the purpose of showing this case. So on October 19, 1983, a woman by the name of Sharon Williams, 43 years old, was found in her car, and she had veered off the side of the road and ended up next, face down, kind of head on. So it's a front end collision, and it's really very minor. And probably the intent was that the vehicle would go on down the abutment, but it didn't. So it just ended up face down. She was taken to the local hospital, found to have a very severe head injury. Next, and she died 13 hours later. Next. Go ahead. Now, we're talking about 1983. So this is now, even though it's a medical examiner, it's operating like a coroner. Next. So the treating physician signed the death certificate. Now that's never going to happen in a real medical examiner system. No hospital, nobody can sign a death certificate that is not a natural manner other than the medical examiner. Vital Records is not going to allow it to go through. And the hospital, they have been trained by my medical examiner's office. My chief investigator goes to the hospitals, goes to any place that might have a dead body and trains those people. These are the deaths that you have to report. So no treating physician is going to be signing that. Although having said that, one time I had a doctor at SLU that signed an accident on a death certificate and somebody that died in a helicopter crash. But, you know, they eventually come to me. So that should never happen. So the woman died back in October. On December 13th, her husband, Jim Williams, collected her insurance policy. Next. And on December 27th, 1983, Walter Scott disappears. Now, Walter Scott, for those of you that don't know, he was a local celebrity. He was in the band, the Bob Cuban Band. How many have ever heard The Cheater? That's Walter Scott singing. So he was, you know, he was a well-known person. And he was also married to a woman, Joanne, that is the girlfriend of Jim Williams. So, next. So on December 27th of 1983, Walter Scott goes out to get a battery and he never comes back. His body was never found despite really extensive searching. And obviously there was suspicion of foul play, but if you don't have a body, usually you can't go forward. Now, in DNA, we can. If we have a little bit of blood, you know, we may say that's too much blood unless you're dead. That amount of blood, you're going to be dead. So we don't always have to have the body, but in these days we did. So obviously the primary suspects was the husband of the dead woman and the wife of the missing man. When I was asked to look at this, this couple were now married and they were living here. I hope she's not in the audience. So what did I do? Well, I looked at the police report. I went to the scene to see what it looked like, but then I looked at the medical records, and there was a lot of medical records. And what I could tell is, well, this woman has massive injury to the back of her head, so this is not consistent with that kind of an accident. So my conclusion is these injuries to the back of her head, that's probably a homicide. So now I need to exhume the body. Now, how do you exhume a body? Well, you can exhume it in two ways. One way is you ask the next of kin. So the next of kin was Jim Williams. I was not going to go to Jim Williams and say, hey, I think you killed your wife. Can I dig her up? You know, that probably wouldn't work. So what we do for criminal investigations is I write a letter to the prosecuting attorney where the body is buried, and I tell them, for these reasons, I need to exhume this body. And it has to be very specific, and it has to be really heavy duty. You have to have good evidence, because we're talking now about a criminal exhumation going against the wishes of the family. So then that prosecuting attorney would present that letter to the court, and the court would give an order of exhumation. I can't go directly to the court and say this. It has to go through the prosecuting attorney. This woman was buried in Marion, Illinois, and over there they call the prosecutor the state's attorney. So I send this letter, very detailed, to the state's attorney and tell him I need to exhume this body. And he said, well, I'm not going to do that. Whew. For 4 months I badgered him to do this, and he would just not have any part of it. He said, I'm not doing that. Next. So what did I do? I did an illegal exhumation. And notice, I did it on April 1st. I thought, hey. And I will say this. What I knew was I am going to find something that is so significant that that court over there will let me now do a legal exhumation. And that's exactly what happened. But when I did the original exhumation, it was illegal. So I took the county counselor with me. It was Dan Pelican. Y'all know Dan. He's now one of our fine judges and a fellow Rotarian. So Dan at that time was a young man, and you know, he loves to tell this story, but he tells it differently than me.
I'm sure he does.
So anyway, so it's Dan and I and 2 deputies, and we go over to Miriam. Now, when you're dealing with an exhumation, you want to, I don't always go to, I have exhumed a lot of bodies, but I don't usually go. I usually have an investigator or a police officer, because you want to photograph the coffin, because how do you think that coffin is going to get out of the ground? It's got to be dug out, and often they use a backhoe. So I want to make sure there's no damage to that coffin that an attorney could claim, well, that's not an injury that existed before the backhoe. So we need to document every step of that operation. So that's why I'm going to this exhumation. And what I did to get the funeral home that buried the body to dig it up is I called the mother of the dead woman, Sharon, and I told her, I said, I think your son-in-law killed your daughter, and I would like to exhume the body. Now, just out of the blue, I call her up and say this, and she cried, and you know, she was very grateful. There's no other word. She thought that he had killed her too. And so, yes, she gave me permission. Even though it was illegal, I did have permission, and so when I go over there, I get the people to dig up this body. And I bring it back next, So here's the coffin. So when we do an exhumation, we bring the coffin into the morgue, and I'm going to photograph it some more. I'm going to photograph it on the outside. I'm going to photograph the body inside. Then I'm going to take the body out. I'll tell you what, in my morgue, I actually have my own coffin key. Anybody else have a coffin key? Not something you see often, but I have one because every now and then we need it. And apparently, the same key will open all coffins. Who would have guessed? So, next. So I do the autopsy, and the body was actually, it had only been down there for 3 years. It's in good shape. There were 2 little minor areas of abrasion on either side of the forehead. So those are injuries that are consistent with this head-on collision. But the injury that caused her to die was at the back of her head. So there were 2 vertical linear lacerations. A laceration looks kind of like a cut, but it's made with a blunt object. And these were as long as my hand at the back of the head, 2 of them, and underneath there were massive skull fractures. So that was her cause of death. Somebody had hit her twice on the back of her head with a blunt object. So I said, well, this is now a homicide. So this is the key. And sometimes we have this situation where this will now lead to a lot of a very rapid input in the investigation. Next. So what happens next is, remember, the examination from the exhumation is on the 1st, the autopsy is on the 2nd. Immediately, 2 deputies go down to Florida, where the son of Jim Williams is in prison for minor drug stuff. And the son had been estranged from his father because of his drug use. And so they go down and they say, we think your dad killed Walter Scott, and if he had the body, do you have any idea what he might have done with it? And he said, well, behind the house where Dad lived was a cistern. And it had just this little light concrete cover on it, and we had the barbecue pit on there. But in the spring of 1984, Dad put this really heavy planter with dirt in it. Next. So this is all happening really fast. They come back from Florida, they get a search warrant. On the 10th of April, they go to that house. They move the planter away, they open the cistern, and there's Walter Scott floating on the surface. Yeah. Talk about a thrill. Let's go back to let's go back. I'll go forward. Yeah. Okay, so that man standing there, that's Ed Eubanger, remember him? Yep. So he was the sheriff, and that he's reading the search warrant. There's the planter, and there's the cistern. The planter's been moved aside. So I actually went to this scene. It takes a lot to get me to a death scene, I just don't have time, but I went to this one. It was like, it's cool and outside, and it was in the evening, and his body's down there, and I'm like, well, his head was skeletonized. I laid on the ground, and I physically picked up with my bare hands, because I didn't have gloves. I didn't know I was going to be taking a head out of the cistern. I removed the head with my bare hands. And then I didn't have anything to wipe them on. We have pictures of all that. Anyway, the rest of the body, they retrieved it with a special thing that they use for getting bodies out of water. So the cistern, for those of you that don't know what a cistern is, it's not like a septic tank. It's fresh water. Before they had water lines, that's where you got your water. But it hadn't been used in years, and so they just covered it up so kids wouldn't fall in. So this water, was nice and clean, and in that cistern, in addition to Walter, was his wallet, and a gun was in there, but it was not the gun that killed him. Next. So there's Walter. So this is on the 11th of April. The next day after opening the cistern, they believe that it's Walter's body. Next. So he was wearing the clothing. It was a blue jogging suit that he had worn when he went out. And he was tied at the wrist and the ankles and at the knees. So what's that about? Well, that was done after he was dead. It's hard to move a dead body. They're flopping around. So you tie him together. He wasn't tied up and then shot. I just don't think that happened. But that was just to move the body. Next. So the body was in what we call adipocere decomposition. That looks like bread, kind of like if you had wet bread and you stuck it together. That's what you look like if you're in a cold, damp thing. We had had his dental x-ray, they had had his dental x-rays available for years, so we could immediately identify him as Walter, and he died from a gunshot wound to the chest. Next. Now that's what an x-ray looks like when you're decomposing. It's kind of fuzzy, but this where you see all of that snowstorm effect up there in the chest, so that's a high velocity bullet. There's no bullet in the body, it goes through, but it leaves that snowstorm effect. So that's all you need to tell why he has died. So the cause of death is a gunshot wound to his chest. It's obviously a homicide. Next. So next, that was kind of like, well, there's the case. So these two individuals were charged with first-degree murder. Next. And there you see Jim. He was a big man wearing the orange suit up at the old, what is now our county executive's office building. Next. Jim was convicted of the murders of both of those individuals. And I will say this, for that trial, I bought a new white suit. And it was in November of 1991. And it, you know, in the old courthouse, the big, where they now have the town hall meetings and stuff. So it's in that courtroom. And I walked in there, it was a gloomy, overcast November day. And I'm sitting on the witness stand, and now remember, it took 4 years after the body was found. The prosecuting attorney didn't have the nerve to prosecute this case. And so they brought in a special prosecutor, but that's a different story. But so it's like, everybody's like, oh, you're never going to convict him. And it's like, he's got a body and his sister. You know, like, that's not incidental. So I'm sitting there in the witness stand, and all of a sudden, the sun comes out, and there's this ray that comes right down on the witness stand where I'm sitting in my white suit. And I'm like, it's a message from God. So he was convicted on 2 murder counts. Next. And he got a life sentence, and he died about 4 or 5 years ago. Next.
At Potosi.
Wherever, I don't know where he was. The wife got 5 years for hindering justice. Next. And there she is. So next, I think that's the last. So that's when I had 3 Westies all at one time. They've got a squirrel up the tree. So at any rate, that's Walter Scott. And I hope this hasn't bothered anybody, because these were regular people and they did a really terrible thing. There were people that knew these individuals. And even I had a lot of empathy for them, but it was like, what a terrible choice you made. So I just say that. I would also like to say a word, because I am a representative of the public health arena. The wisest choice you will ever make, you can make at this point, to be vaccinated. There is nothing more important that you can do in your life to maintain health and safety. With that, I would like to thank you for your attention and for having me here. Johnny?
Well, I know we ran over, but does anybody have any quick questions for Dr. Case? Let me say, I worked in the criminal justice system for a long time, and I've also taught at the community college, and I took students down to Potosi, which is where Jim Williams was incarcerated. And the one time we were down there, the guy said, oh, we've got that guy from St. Charles County here, and look at, there's his clothes over hanging off, because he worked in the woodworking shop down at Potosi. And I mean, honest to God, I think his pants were like that big. And he was so tall that when the jail was on 2nd Street, if you all remember the house, he was so big that he would have to duck to go through the doorway. And Frame and Tiemann, do you guys remember this? The man that died in the Michael Wayne Jackson case, the man that ran off the road, his son-in-law was an O'Fallon police officer. Do you know, had you ever heard that? No, okay, that's what I had heard. So, and Walter Notice's son became a police officer and is now a firefighter paramedic.
Yeah.
So.
He's now working as a firefighter.
Huh?
He's now working as a firefighter.
Firefighter, right. All right, well, I'm really sorry we ran long, but I think you will admit that it was worth it. Do we have a motion to adjourn? Second? Thank you. See you next time.